Hello, Robert. How are you doing over there?
I'm doing great. Glad to talk to you, Glenn.
Yeah. This is Glenn Loury, of course. This is the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. I'm the host, Glenn Loury, professor of economics at Brown University, and it's my pleasure to be speaking today with Robert Cherry, who is professor of economics at Brooklyn College and at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And I've invited Robert on the show to talk about an absolutely critical issue, a public policy issue that confronts the country right now, which is how to respond to the social problems of low-income minority communities in the cities of the country. This is an issue that's been underscored by President Donald Trump, who, as everybody knows, campaigned on the promise to fix, quote unquote, fix the inner city problems. He says, what do people living there have to lose? Vote for him. He'll fix the problem. The Democrats haven't done them any good, so he says. And we're not here to, grind any kind of partisan acts. We're here to talk about what the problems are and how to fix them. And I thought that Bob would be a very interesting person to hear from about this because he has been devoting a lot of attention in his research and his public writings to the issue of joblessness as a factor affecting the quality of life for low-income communities in the United States. Thanks for allowing me this extended introduction, Robert. I just want to kind of frame the conversation because, as you have said in your writings, there really are two different attitudes that people bring to these problems of disadvantage, violence, social marginality, and so forth amongst minority communities in the cities. One is to stress the violence, which President Trump himself has done. He says, that carnage is afoot. He says that this is something that should not happen in America. He says that a city like Chicago, which is the adopted hometown of President Barack Obama, is example number one. It's a leading case of what's gone wrong with the democratic governance over urban areas because the violence is so rampant. To which many people, some of them liberals, will respond by saying, well, yeah, there's violence, but you know what? There also aren't any jobs for these kids. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, I might point out, had an op-ed piece in the Chicago Sun-Times just a few days ago, stressing just this point. He says, if we were to bring jobs, work, the teenage unemployment rate, so forth is so high, we would solve the problem. So on the one side, there are people who lament the high levels of violence. On the other side, there are people who say, what should you expect? There aren't any jobs. And you, Robert, have addressed yourself to this issue, and I just wanted to hear what your take is on the problems, the relationship between joblessness and violence, and on how you think a Donald Trump or anybody else who wants to do something about this should proceed. So I turn it over to you just to, let us hear from you about these things, not wanting to dominate the conversation.
Well, let me say that this liberal view, which says, I'm reading from a leading sociology book, crime rates are higher on average in African American than other neighborhoods, not because this group is more criminally oriented, but because African American communities have the highest average level of disadvantaged social conditions owing to the role of race in structuring opportunity and community access.
Right.
That it's all structural. One of the problems with that is there's a lot of different kind of crime you can talk about. There are burglaries, more economic crime, where this may be somewhat true. But for violent crime, I think there's decisive evidence, and I presented this evidence in a Real Clear policy article last week. There's real clear evidence that joblessness is not systematically related to violent crime rates. And I did that in a number of ways. One is I looked at 34 of the largest U.S. cities and found that if you simply had a measure of what share of the population of 20 to 34-year-old men, what share was black, you got a very, very close correlation to the violent crime rates, an R square of 0.75, just by regressing the share of youth who were black to the violent crime rate. And then I tried to see if that would be impacted by putting in measures of joblessness, by putting measures of police per capita, and there was no change. I got a somewhat higher R squared, but it was still, all you need to know is that what share of 20 to 34-year-old men are black. Now, that is one measure of how violent crime is separate from unemployment. I also
Robert, excuse me for interrupting, but I want to make sure our viewers understand, and not all of them are statisticians. You took a sample of the nation's largest cities. You looked to try to explain variation across the cities in that sample in the incidence of violent crime. You first correlated that with the proportion of the population in those cities who were African American males of a certain age, and found that you could explain 3/4 of the variance across cities in the incidence of violent crime simply by looking at the variance across those same cities in the proportion of their populations that were African American males of a certain age. The greater that proportion, the more violence crime. The correlation explains 75% of the variance. You then asked whether you could explain more by taking into account the difference across those cities in the extent of joblessness, and found that you could explain only a little bit more. But most of the action had to do with the relative number of African American males of a certain age who were in the population. That's what you found. That's a startling finding. And I just want to, again, underscore, what you were saying, because everybody out there doesn't know what an R squared is, but they can all understand. They can all understand that most of the variation across cities in the incidence of violent crime is accounted for by the size of the African American male population of a certain age in those cities.
Yes, and then I referenced some sociological studies that looked at communities, 250 of these communities across the country where there was high levels of homogeneity of race, gender, race and ethnicity. So there were white communities, there were Latino communities, and there were black communities. And what this study found is even after adjusting for the level of poverty in communities, after adjusting for the level of unemployment in communities, black communities had much higher rates of violent crime, even ones that had relatively low levels of poverty concentration, relatively low levels of unemployment, that they had much higher rates of violent crime than white communities and Latino communities. So there is a reasonable amount of statistical evidence that says there's something going on with a cohort of young black men that seems to be driving the violent crime statistics, and that it is not going to be solved by changing employment figures, so that's one thing. And I think that, there have been other people like Elijah Anderson and even Ta-Nehisi Coates that kind of verify this. If one reads Coates' book, The Beautiful Struggle, his book prior to his sort of landmark book, Between the World and Me, in that book where he talks about growing up in Baltimore in the late 1980s, he talks about the gratuitousness of the violence. He talks about how young people, they had to toughen themselves up because if they were looked weak, they would be taken advantage of. And in fact, he gives himself as an example where once he backed down from fights, he was abused by other kids, even the nerdy kids in his special program in the Baltimore middle school. So, and it also leads to middle-class black families moving out of central city neighborhoods. His own parents moved out of central Baltimore to the suburbs. I mean, his father was a committed black nationalist, and yet found, for the sake of his family and the 4 or 5 kids that were living with them, it was better to have suburban life. So
Okay, Bob.
Yeah.
Let's put Ta-Nehisi to the side for a moment. I mean, why doesn't what you're saying amount to the claim that there is something inherently violently, criminally oriented about the culture or the ways of life adopted by African American men in the cities? I mean, it is a kind of cultural argument, isn't it? Asking.
I would phrase it differently, and that is to say that if people are interested in reducing this violent crime, which even though it's a small cohort of people, it plagues neighborhoods, and as I suggested, it leads middle-class working blacks to move out of those neighborhoods and therefore lead to an even larger concentration of poor people who have no networks to get jobs, etc. I would say that this primarily means that we should take seriously looking at various explanations other than poverty and joblessness. I'm not committed to any of the possibilities that people could put in, and I am worried about some of the ideas that people will put in there, but I'm primarily saying that's where we have to look, that there are things that are not poverty, that are not joblessness, that are going on in these communities that we have to figure out. But this is a whole downside. What I'm much more interested in is looking at the kinds of dysfunctional dynamics that go on that are related to joblessness. My study found that 2 out of every 5 black men, 20 to 34, 2 out of 5 in urban areas were jobless between 2010 and 2014. That is, this joblessness goes well beyond teenagers. It goes well beyond those who don't have a high school degree or only a GED. It's deplorable, and obviously on its own merits something should be done about it. But what I try to show in this article and other things that I've written and researched is that there are adverse behaviors that go on within the black family that are very much linked to this joblessness.
Okay, but criminal violence is not one of those behaviors in your view.
That's right.
Okay, so
criminal violent behavior. In other words, I'm not, burglaries. There are 150 times more burglaries than violent crimes in urban America. So we have to be careful and say, when we talk about violent crime, It's a very small amount of the crime that goes on.
Yeah.
It is done by a small cohort, but it's not insignificant, and we have to deal with it.
Okay, but joblessness is not the engine driving
That's right.
the
That's
violent
right.
crime in your view. Okay, so we want to talk about joblessness, but before we do that, I just want to stay for a moment on this issue about violence. Here is what some people committed to the idea that structural racism lies at the root of the violence problem would say. They would say, well, in many black communities, people don't trust the police because the police have treated them badly in the past. The police have acted as agents of structural racism, and that's resented by the residents of those communities. As a result, they don't cooperate with the police. One implication of which is that the police have a hard time actually finding people who commit violent acts, which implies, given that the community doesn't trust the police and for good reason, that those who want to commit violent acts can rely on being able to do so with relative impunity, since the community won't cooperate with the police because the police have been abusive to the community. Therefore, the incentives to engage in violence, if you live in a community where the residents don't trust the police, are much greater than they would be elsewhere. And as a consequence, the fact that the police have not earned the community's trust is a causal factor in generating the violence. So you see higher violence in black communities, but you also see less trust of the police in those communities. Those two things are linked, and structural racism lies at the root of both.
I reject that totally for a number of reasons. One is that this suggests there's a certain rationality to behavior, which as an economist, after all, that's our what we do. I think that this could make some sense in terms of economic crimes like burglaries. But if one looks at the violent crime, those are impulsive acts by and large. Somebody disses you and you're going to get them back. It's increasingly has nothing to do with the drug trade, that these gangs are not involved with drug trade and drug territory. So that, the idea that there is this level of rationality is somewhat limited as far as I'm concerned. Where it would have some impact is whether or not the aggressive police behavior can be effective to keep guns off the street. If you keep guns off the street, then maybe that's going to limit violent behavior. And certainly part of the dynamics of stop and frisk and more proactive policing was that it did seem to keep guns off the street, at least in New York and Philadelphia, it seemed to keep guns off the street. But beyond that, I just don't see how, again, for burglaries and economic crimes, jumping turnstiles, I can see a certain logic in this, but not violent crime.
Well, I just want to underscore, because I know you want to go on and talk about what you think some of the negative consequences of joblessness actually are, violent crime not being one of them in your view. I just want to underscore how radical the position that you're taking is vis-a-vis what seems to be the kind of consensus view, at least the sort of moderate and progressive consensus view on these matters, which is that the police need to ratchet down the intrusiveness of their intervention. They need to back off. We need less police, not more police involvement in the lives of people in inner city communities, and that we need more opportunity. I mean, Trump takes Chicago as a showcase instance of failure, and he says, we're going to fix it. His political enemies respond by saying he's an opportunist and that he proposes nothing substantive to actually fix the problem. What we need are more investment in those communities, more money, more opportunity. There's hopelessness there.
I agree that the focus should be on employment for for these other reasons. I mean, after all, whether or not there was violent crime, having 40% of young men jobless
It's a bad thing.
It's a bad thing. So I'm not justifying stop and frisk. In New York City, what I asked with stop and frisk was what percentage of the people who were stopped were actually frisked? If it was like 10%, it'd be like the airport. It'd be a nuisance, someone stopping you on the street, asking you A, B, and C, and then you move on. But in New York City, it was 50%. One out of every two people who were stopped were frisked. And so for me, that was a real civil liberties intrusion. But what the left has to understand is that there's a trade-off. They like to believe that it was simply a gratuitous intrusion, and it should be stopped. But the fact is that I'm prepared to say, and it looks like evidence, this Ferguson effect, where you have less proactive policing, seems to indicate that in a number of cities, including maybe even especially Chicago, that this ending of proactive policing does have this consequence. But again, I'd like to move on.
Okay, let's move on. Let's talk then about what are some of the deleterious consequences of joblessness that really do trouble you, violence not being one of them, but there are others.
Well, street violence doesn't, but what led me down this road is when I began to see other aspects of abusive behavior disproportionately by black men. So that if we look at things like predatory behavior towards adolescent women, which was related to high pregnancy rates. I'm
sorry, Bob, what do you mean by predatory behavior?
That there's coercive, men often 4, 5, and 6 years older latch on to 15, 16, and 17-year-old poor black women and are fairly coercive in their desire for sexual relations.
Okay, so you're meaning an age disparity in the partnerships, the sexually active partnerships that form. That's what you're implying with, quote, predatory, close quote.
Yeah, and I'm not just, this, if you look at the research out of Penn by Van Furstenberg, a super liberal, he was concerned about this. He called it a lack of contraceptive vigilance, i.e., the men didn't want the girls, they were unwilling to use contraception when they had sexual relations. So there's a whole literature on this kind of aggressive male behavior that led to teenage pregnancies.
And you have reason to think that this is a more frequent phenomenon amongst African Americans than other Americans?
Well, there were studies that seemed to show that being true.
Okay.
There's intimate violence, what we used to call domestic violence.
Yeah.
Again, there's significant evidence that over the last 20 years, while it's been reduced, it's still disproportionately black men. And what really sort of, put me over the edge, made me feel a desire to be more aggressive around this is when I looked at child maltreatment statistics. You look at those statistics, and if you look at single black mothers, single white mothers, if there are no men present, there's less child maltreatment in the black than the white households.
No men present in terms of residence in the household. Right. Okay. Wow. Wow. I said, wow. That kind of surprises me, but it's
on the other hand, when you look at these single-headed households, when there is a man present who is not the father of all of the children, the rate for these black family structures of child maltreatment, particular emotional abuse and endangerment, the rates now are double comparable white households. So when these men are in the households, they bring in their anger. They don't necessarily beat up the children, but you have emotional abuse, you have endangerment, and so you have pretty chaotic families in poor black communities. Not all, but disproportionately, and certainly I'm prepared to say it then manifests itself in antisocial behavior in the schools. When you look at 5- and 6-year-old young black kids from central cities, there's much higher rates of suspension and just antisocial behavior. I'm not a fan of suspensions, but you get these manifestations, and by the time they get to the high school, they're well behind academically. They have even often stronger antisocial behavior where they cuss out teachers, etc. And you just have this road to joblessness.
Okay, hold on.
set out.
Hold on. I want to slow you down a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, so we're looking at African American households with a man present who's not the father of all the children, and we're finding exceptionally high levels of child endangering behavior in those households.
Yes.
You're comparing them to white households, which are also characterized by a man being present who's not the father of all the children?
Yes.
But you're nevertheless finding the black households who are so situated having much higher levels of child endangering behavior.
Yes.
You think that you can explain this racial difference in terms of the difference in the employment opportunities of the men in these households?
Yes.
Okay, so talk about
I
that.
have.
He has. Talk about that.
So I did a study that was published a year ago in Child Services Journal, a pretty reputable journal. And what I was able to look at with my co-investigator, a colleague of mine, Chun Wang, we looked at from 2000 to 2012, we looked at variation in child, not by race, the overall variation in child maltreatment rates across the 50 states in the Union, and we saw to what extent they could be statistically explained by various factors, single-headedness, poverty. So a number of factors had a systematic, predictable relationship, but one of the things that stood out was that if you looked at the employment rate of men 25 to 34, and actually 20 to 34, you looked at the employment rate of these men, they, in a very strong, statistically significant way, impacted on child maltreatment rates. For every 1% that employment rates increased, child maltreatment rates decreased by 1%. So for me, that meant if you could drop the black joblessness rate from 40% to 30%, you could lower these maltreatment rates by 10%. So that's pretty significant. And for me, I think it explains a substantial amount of the racial difference, because there are just many more black men who are jobless than white men who are jobless, and it's going to drive these child maltreatment rates.
So you don't think that joblessness affects blacks differently than whites. You just think that there's a higher extent of joblessness among blacks, and that accounts for some of the other differences that we're seeing between blacks and whites.
Right, these levels of child maltreatment, even domestic violence, intimate violence. If you adjust for poverty, uh, you find that most of the variation between black and white domestic violence rates disappears. So again, what I'm saying, if you look at these other forms of abuse that are much more internal to the family, that have much more potentially damaging effect for kids and the future generations, these, I think, are much more that the kind of liberal view that says this has to do with poverty and joblessness, I think there it's correct.
Okay. It occurs to me, I wonder what you think about this, that there's a kind of, I don't know, self-fulfilling prophecy dimension to this, if you think it in intergenerational terms. Kids are growing up in households. The households are characterized by, let's say, the presence of a jobless male. I'm talking about an African-American family in a low-income district. There are behaviors in that household that are damaging to the kid. The kid then shows up at school, perhaps psychologically damaged by behaviors, predatory or maltreatment behaviors in the household associated with the presence of a jobless male. The kid doesn't do well in school or acts out in ways that lead to him being suspended. Now the kid is going to be scarred over the course of their development by the fact that they didn't get adequate education, one reason for which is that the problems that they encountered in their own household impeded their ability to benefit from school. They might have gotten suspended, they might not have learned as much, and so forth. The kid becomes an adult. The adult has children of his own. The households in which those children are raised, etc. The cycle repeats itself. I mean, we hear a lot, and I want your comment on this, and I'll stop, about the school-to-prison pipeline. And the theory seems to be that the same structures of discipline and control that operate within schools are replicated in prisons. And so the structural racism of suppressing black people begins at the earliest stages but continues on into adulthood. But you're talking about something different. You're talking about a kind of internalized problem where the households in which these kids are raised are troubled by what happened in the previous generation. And while there could be problems in the schools, and certainly mass incarceration could be an issue to look at, if we don't look at some of these behavioral things inside of families, we're not going to be able to really solve the problem.
Look, it doesn't even have to be abusive patterns within the household. It may simply be the kind of absent biological father that you look at Pew studies and others, that once a man has left his relationship, and particularly if he enters a new relationship where he has new children, he virtually abandons his first group of children. And that alone could create psychological difficulties. I don't want to use the word damaged, but they create psychological difficulties. And so there's a lot of reasons why this joblessness and family disorganization that goes on, this sort of sequential relationships where you have multi-partner fertility, you have kids with one partner, and then you break up and you have kids with another. In the upper middle class, it's called blended families, right?
Yes.
That these are just difficulties that have to be dealt with at K through 5. There has to be a reach inside the family when kids are acting up at school. It's not simply having the kid get a little bit more counseling. In fact, there's not enough counseling in K through 5. There are very few schools that have those support services. But even if they don't somehow be able to interact with the family, it's not going to get very far. Now, where we look at this and trying to solve it is what happens when these kids go to high school and don't do very well. That's where much of the energy, where we have real attempts in New York City. There are 200,000 what are called disconnected youth, 17 to 19-year-olds to 24-year-olds who are neither in school nor work. And there are 100 programs in New York City to try to deal with this population. So you said you wanted to speak about what can be done about this joblessness. And here I'm actually quite troubled by the perspective of many.
Okay, Bob, I want to stop you again and forgive me. I
Yeah.
think I know where you're going. Many people have the wrong idea in your view about how to deal with joblessness. I definitely want to hear from that, but I want to say something else first.
Okay.
It has to do with suspensions of kids who act out in school, or the dealing with kids who act out in school. And here's what I'm hearing you say, and I think people, perhaps even Marianne Wright Edelman herself, who has made a big deal about the school-to-prison pipeline, would agree and be heartened. I hear you saying behavioral problems from a kid in school are a problem for the school, for sure. But they are also a signal, loud and clear, that something is wrong in the household from which the kid has come. I get a kid acting out in school, good chance that there's some problem in that household. Rather than dealing with the kid's problematic behavior simply by disciplining the kid, kicking them out for a couple of weeks or for a semester or whatever because they're bad actors, it would be much better if the schools were to respond to behavioral problems from the kids by trying to look behind the family from which the kid has come and see if there isn't some intervention that can support and help that family do a better job of nurturing and socializing the children who are living there. You want social workers, I don't want to put words in your mouth, you can tell me if I'm wrong, who can go back to the home from which this problematically behaving kid has come and make some inquiries about what's going on there. Of course, it could be a little bit intrusive, and they're not always going to be met with a, warm welcome by the parents when they show up knocking on the door. But you want to follow that kid home from school and take a look at what's going on and see if you can't help that family do a better job raising that kid. You don't just simply want to put the burden on the kid. Am I reading you?
Yes.
Well, that's good because that's something that I think progressives should be able to get behind, this idea that we want to support these families, not simply, label them or call them names or whatever, and that we want to support these kids. We can't ignore the problematic behaviors, but we don't have to respond to them simply by, treating the kid as if he's a junior criminal and, isolating them from their other classmates or kicking them out of school.
Well, you would think so, but there are a good number of liberals, I can think offhand of Catherine Eden, who are aggressive in rejecting the idea that focusing in any way on the parenting of black children in poor neighborhoods is anything but kind of white paternalism imposing their values on loving parents. She spent a decade writing books to try to verify that. Let me just give one example of this fear of being paternalistic. Michelle Obama, one of her signal issues was diet in black communities. The explosion of type 2 diabetes, and it's linked to bad eating habits. She was aggressive and somewhat successful in getting the food stamp program to change the way it treated if you bought fruits and vegetables. People got bonuses to their food stamps if they did that. There was another approach, which was to say, we're not going to allow people on food stamps to buy sugary drinks. 10% of food stamps are spent on sugary drinks.
What?
10% of food stamps.
Is that that's a national figure? Or
that's a national.
Oh man, that's hard to believe. That's hard to believe.
Another 10% are spent on snacks.
Unbelievable. I don't believe you. Show me the numbers. Really?
I got this from Trump, so I'm not sure. No,
Well,
I'll
no.
send you that. So,
The
so
Department of Agriculture, I mean, food stamps, they get a card now. It's all electronic. You can find out exactly what people are spending their money on.
that's where the data comes from. Now, it took a while for their willingness to release this data, but people like Mayor Bloomberg, the state of Maine, a number of places said, we want the federal government to restrict. After all, there are restrictions on what you can spend food stamps on.
Yeah.
We want to extend those restrictions to sugary drinks.
Yeah.
The liberal community was against it. Michelle Obama never spoke in favor. You wouldn't know from Michelle Obama that that was an issue because from their perspective, we don't go beyond presenting positive alternatives for people. That
Yeah.
and so I think that there's a real reluctance, and you will find there will be a real reluctance to extend the kind of social work reach beyond dealing with the kids' manifestations in the school to trying to encourage or force discussions where parents have to come into school and discuss with the social worker, try to set out a plan of rectifying situations.
Yeah.
Now, the fact is, schools aren't spending money on even having social workers in the schools, in the K through 5.
Because they don't have any money.
That's right. They don't have any money. So we haven't gotten to that point.
I just want to underscore for people here because, if y'all are listening, what Robert Cherry is saying here is extraordinary. 1/5 of every food stamp dollar goes either to purchase a sugary drink or a snack. Okay? 1/5. You can't buy beer with your food stamps.
That's right.
But you can buy Coca-Cola with your food stamps, and you can buy Pringles with your food stamps. And one in five food stamp dollars goes to doing that. This is terrible for the health of the people who are consuming these products. We already know that in advance. However, any effort to actually do something about it by, for example, telling people, here are food stamps, you can buy green vegetables, you can buy meat, you can buy rice, but you can't buy sugary drinks with it, gets resisted because it's perceived as somebody wagging their finger and telling people how to live their lives, and people should be free.
No, it's not just waving your finger. After all, a lot of progressives don't have any problem in other areas, but this is waving your fingers at poor people.
Okay.
And I can appreciate that. You have to be careful how you deal with what you think is inappropriate behavior of poor people. After all, there was a host stink, and I think maybe correctly so, when under Mayor Bloomberg's administration, there were posters put up on the subways where they had young black women with saying to them, you should know what happens if you have a kid. And it gave all the statistics of what happens, that the shaming, that was clearly an attempt to shame people into what you thought was the proper behavior. And, that was unfortunate. But there's a continuum between shaming and just letting people do what you want for fear of being paternalistic. And, maybe some conservatives are too much on the side of, well, we should shame people, versus liberals who say, well, we can't at all touch this. Let's move on.
Okay, no, I got it. And it's related to what you wanted to talk about. You say joblessness is a problem, and you say there's some thinking in some circles, I suspect that they are more often than not liberal circles, that impedes doing what you think needs to be done about joblessness. And I want you to talk about that for a little bit.
Okay, well, So we have this population, they get into high schools, and they're well behind academically, they have certain antisocial behaviors. Historically, what shaped up people in that situation was teen employment. And 4 or 5 years ago, I published a number of articles which promoted the idea of figuring out how we could get more teen employment. But the reality is that's a past world. That teen employment rates for black teenagers is about 1 in 7 have paid employment. Even for white teenagers, it's 2 in 7. You know, it's double, but teen employment has really gone the way. One of the reasons it's gone the way is this view that everyone should go on to college, that getting these menial jobs, they're dead end, they don't go anywhere. And so one of my concerns has been this pushing everyone possible into community college with the opportunity for them to move on to the 4-year college and get a 4-year degree, because that's where you can make a decent living. And I'm doing a study that looks at prison reentry programs.
Yes.
And you could say all you want about prisons, but at least in New York State, prisons have been very aggressive and pretty effective at getting inmates to finish their high school equivalency degree, or, more than half of the people who go to prisons don't have a high school degree when they go in.
Yeah.
So you have a population that they've been pretty effective. There's a lot of carrots, some sticks that are used. This is true in the federal prisons. Getting many of them either to finish successfully the high school equivalency degree, or with a soon after release prep program passing it. The problem from my perspective is, at least in New York City, everyone who comes out of prison and has completed a high school equivalency degree or completes it soon after, the only option that is promoted for them is going to the community college with the expectation, and certainly in New York City, the community colleges are geared to the transfer function. You go in for 2 years, you transfer to the 11 4-year colleges in the CUNY system. And no certificate programs, no vocational training. This is the track that's given. And I looked at what is an incredibly positive program in the Bronx, where literally the people in the program are doing God's work. And I don't mean that facetiously. They are personally committed to helping these previously incarcerated people who have gotten the high school equivalency degree, funnel their, to navigate their way through the community college system. Only 1 of 4 of the people who begin with them, 1 in 4 get the associate's degree. That is 3/4 in what is one of the best programs you can imagine, because these are people who have housing stresses, they have family stresses, they have economic stresses, and these are people who've had failure in the educational system. They haven't had anything positive happen to them. And you send them in where they're, at least for 2 or 3 years, have to work towards an associate's degree. They have to go through remediation classes first, and so on. You're setting them up, however well-intentioned, for failure. So what's the approach that's being taken in CUNY for them and other at-risk students who don't get through? They're just dumbing down the assessment exam. The assessment exam, as many people know, the key one that holds people back is the math assessment exam. which has mostly arithmetic, but some modest amount of algebra. So what they've decided is they're going to take algebra out of the assessment exam. So it'll just be arithmetic. And, you know, some of the senior colleges are worried because then you get people into the senior colleges who really can't do the work that you expect. So at Brooklyn College, we're already seeing that. The provost just sent out a notice that he's worried that too many of the people we have at Brooklyn, 3/4 of the students are transfer students, the overwhelming from the community colleges, that, you know, 500 students are going on probation every semester, 200 are being expelled, that something has to be done about it. And he thinks it could be more tutoring and more support services when we're just taking people in who don't have the skills. So I was struck. I've talked to people who do certificate programs in the CUNY system. These are from 6-month to 1-year programs that set people up for employment and are effective programs in many cases. And he says nobody in this prison reentry, they have no interest in talking to him for people who have high school equivalency degrees. People who don't have high school equivalency degrees, there's some discussion with him about some programs. But you get the high school equivalency degree, you're in the community colleges, you're not in these certificate programs.
Bob, I want to interrupt for a minute. I want to interrupt just to make sure that everybody understands what's being said here, because I think it's important. So you're using the prison reentry treatment of formerly incarcerated people who are coming back to society as an example of a more general point.
Yes.
How they deal with educating these people who have been in prison is the question. The choices are, crudely, an academic track or vocational track. Where by academic track, you go to a 2-year community college, you get a certificate, you get an associate's degree, and you then transfer it to a 4-year college, and the ultimate goal is a BA or a BS that allows you to get a job with a college degree. You're saying that many of the people in the prison reentry program in particular, but in society more broadly, who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, simply don't have the skills and the preparation to allow them to succeed in an academic track, but they might be able to succeed in a vocational track, and yet they're not being directed in that way.
Let me just go a little further. It's not that they may not have the academic and behavioral traits, but they're coming from very difficult situations. They have housing problems. Many of these previously incarcerated.
Yeah.
They have drug problems.
Yeah.
They got money problems. So, you know, we have a lot of things. So, as I said, it's 1 out of every 4 from this program. In that community college, the overall success rate of people who enter getting associate's degrees is less than 20%. So this prison reentry program actually does better than the overall because they do have the support services. They meet with them once a week in groups. You know, they're on top of a lot of stuff. So if it's even worse for people who don't have these support services but come from these struggling environments of housing and job, you know, and income problems. So I think these certificate programs are just, it just blows my mind that they're not looked at.
And the reason this is important in your mind, and this is a question, is that because employment is so critical to the overall success of a person, whether formerly incarcerated or not, and to the integrity and the coherence of the household in which they're living, employment is so critical. The educational treatment, you know, if it's vocational and it gets them oriented toward a job and it sends them out to a job, or if it's a more academic and they end up failing and coming away with nothing at all, can make all the difference in the world because it can be the key to getting employment.
I want to go further than that, and what I said I don't want to be lost, and that is
Okay.
these are overwhelmingly people who have had utter failure in academic settings, that being successful at a short-term certificate program can be built on. I'm a firm believer in building on success. When I did studies on welfare reform 10 years ago, I remember a woman, a nursing director. She, in her nursing facility, was running a 10-week program for nurses' aides. And she said when those people graduated, those women, they brought their families to that graduation. They got dressed up every much as I did when my kids graduated college.
Yeah.
That was an important, and they were proud of being successful.
Yeah.
And I'm getting a little emotional here.
Wow.
And that's the kind of vision that we should have for these young adults, that they thirst for success. They thirst for recognition. And these certificate programs are an opportunity for them to quench that thirst a little bit.
Wow, that's something. I detect a connection between what we were saying earlier about, intervening or try to influence the behavior of disadvantaged people in their homes in terms of kids who are coming to school with problems, and the current topic of trying to intervene in ways that are helpful to people getting jobs, namely that recognizing the actual disadvantage that people are working under and responding to that in a way that takes that disadvantage seriously and tries to address it, which might mean paternalism. It might mean delimiting the choices of a family about how to spend their food stamps, or it might mean directing somebody to a vocational program rather than a pie-in-the-sky academic ideal. That the ability to do that is impeded by conventional beliefs of people about how the poor are no different than anybody else. The poor, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so please correct me or take your disagreement. But the poor are different in certain ways, not because they're intrinsically different, but because the circumstances of their lives are relevant to how it is that you need to deal with their problems going forward. And taking that on board, being prepared to recognize that there are issues particular to the poor that have to be taken on their own terms is a key to actually being helpful to solving the problems of poverty.
Well, there's always this issue of expectations. So there's this fear that too many people will be consigned to this vocationalism because of this stereotype that is being described of they come from these circumstances, they have this, they have that. We have to take that into account, and we have to, after all, you were using pie in the sky for this academic. For certain, you can talk about your own history, right? I mean, it isn't as if you came from parents who were academicians, right?
That's right.
So we have to be careful, but I think the pendulum has swung too far away from looking at this vocationalism, particularly when a lot of those jobs aren't all that bad. But I want to give one last example.
Good.
Obama had this My Brother's Keepers initiatives run by Michael D. Smith. The left hated it. They just pounded him for exactly this low expectations stuff. And he, instead of expanding it, he backed away from it. And he was at Brooklyn, and he was at this P-Tech, and he opened it up and so on. But this idea, this my brother's keeper, which is along the lines that we would be pursuing, was not something that liberals, and particularly the left liberals, at all thought of as positive. So it's an uphill battle with my colleagues in academia to win them to this. They're much more willing to lower the standards on math remediation, get rid of algebra, because after all, what do you need algebra for, right? So anyway,
All right.
I think that's where I am.
All right. You know what, Bob? You remind me of the old definition of a neoconservative. I don't know who came up with this, Irving Kristol, Daniel Moynihan, somebody. A liberal who's been mugged by reality. What I detect in talking to you is, it probably goes back to your old lefty origins, is a guy who really cares about people who are disadvantaged, but who's prepared to look reality in the face and respond accordingly. And I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us here at the Glenn Show.
Well, thank you for letting me. It's been worthwhile for me, this discussion.
Okay, Bob. Well, take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.